Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in to August's virtual town hall. Unfortunately, we are still in the pandemic times and we are unable to meet in person. Just like I've let you know in previous months, I really miss the engagement in person. I miss seeing all of you that we've built relationships with. I miss meeting new people in the communities, and I really look forward to being able to get back together in person. Unfortunately, the reality we're all living within right now is that there's not exactly an end in sight. As of right now, a lot of the community centers that we would previously host our monthly meetings at are not allowing in-person gatherings until at least the end of August, and they say that they're going to reevaluate at the end of August. And so one thing that I am interested in is come the cooler months, come the fall, if we still are in the pandemic that we're in right now, then maybe we can host meetings at a park or somewhere with open air, social distancing, and protective measures. So I know there's a desire for in-person engagement, and we're looking into ways that we can actually get back to interacting in person. I know it's not easy with tuning in virtually and folks tuning in on different devices, and I encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or need any resources for accessing these types of events. Our team has been there in it just like you have, with trying to figure out how to adjust to these times and how to do different things on Zoom and access different online resources and tutorials. And so if you're struggling in any kind of way with accessing our virtual reality, please reach out to us, and we may have a resource that we could send your way that you might find helpful. All right, let's go ahead and just dive right into our different projects. First, we're going to talk about the San Jacinto River Waste Pit Superfund site. And our primary project for many years has been the San Jacinto River Coalition, and we seek full remediation of the Waste Pit Superfund site, and we advocate that it is done as safely and effectively as possible. And most recently, we received huge reports that we've been waiting on. I've been talking to y'all about for months, and these are the 30% design documents. So these are reports that outline the early understanding of how the waste pits will be remediated and what the characterization of the waste looks like and how it will ultimately be disposed of and handled in perpetuity. We know that the EPA has estimated that if the waste were to remain in the waste pits, it would remain toxic for upwards of 750 more years. So, we're talking about a due diligence here on the front end of making sure that the site is safely remediated, looking towards protecting public health around the San Jacinto River, the people who live, work, play, worship, and all of the other things that people do living and recreating around the San Jacinto River. And also looking to protect the aquatic habitat in the river and the environmental quality across the board. And, we have a lot of unknowns still, even though we've, recently received these reports, which I tell you, they detail over 30,000 pages, honestly, probably even over 40,000 pages of documents. And so we have been doing our best to digest these reports, and we're going to host a live Zoom webinar tomorrow to really take a deep dive into these documents and highlight our thoughts, our findings, concerns, what direction it looks like this remediation is going to go. But I'm not going to do that in this town hall because it's definitely going to take over an hour. So I'm going to do more of a high level touch on each area of the waste pits and some of the knowns and unknowns to date. The 30% design documents, as well as their numerous and lengthy appendices, can all be found on the EPA's website in the link below. We had a CAC meeting, or a community advisory meeting, with the community advisory stakeholders last week, and Gary Baumgartner, the remedial project manager for the EPA, provided a presentation touching on the northern impoundments 30% design, the southern impoundments 30% design, as well as the sand separation area and the San Jacinto River fleet, which has continued throughout the years to seek permits for various items for their fleeting facility that is just north of the northern impoundments and actually it's adjacent to the sand separation area, but it really actually operates in and around that immediate area. So we received an overview of these areas, and we had a little less than a half hour to ask the agency our questions. So we are absolutely going to be following up with a formal letter. And one of the most startling pieces of information that I heard during this meeting was, when the record of decision was signed by Administrator Pruitt, we then thought that the remediation would take 2 years. And now that we're through the 30% design, it's looking like remediation is actually going to take 7 years. So that's extremely concerning. That's over 3 times as long for them to actually procure the material, undergo construction, removing the waste, hauling it off, and then ultimately removing the cofferdams that are put in place to protect the construction while it takes place. So that was pretty startling to hear. And I know that for those of you who are living in the communities around this Superfund site, it's going to be startling to you as well. We thought 2 years, 2 hurricane seasons, and this would be remediated. And now we're not just looking at 1 or 2 hurricane seasons or 3 or 4. We're looking at more than that. And I'm concerned about it. But I wanted to just give you assurance that we are advocating on the community's behalf, on the coalition's behalf, to see that this is done safely and making sure that there's checks and balances in place, there are emergency response plans in place, decontamination zones, all of the best management practices that there can be to see that this is remediated as safely as possible and disposed of appropriately. So far, I have spent the most time reading every word of the Northern Impoundments 30% design. I've not been able to spend as much time in the Southern document just yet. I will be looking into it, but there's one appendices in particular that I've spent a lot of time going through, and that's Appendix C, which has all of the lab reports for the waste characterization. So I'm going to talk to you about all of them, but as the weeks continue, we will continue to have a greater understanding of the ins and outs of all of these documents, and not just the bullet points that are being presented to us from the EPA. I've talked to you before in recent town halls about the new understanding of how deep the actual waste goes in the northern pit, and that it is in fact incredibly toxic all the way down to 25 feet, and how this is mounting the complexity of remediation. And looking at an increased depth of contamination is obviously going to increase the amount of material that is going to need to be excavated, moved off site, and ultimately disposed of. And so right now, it looks to be about a 30% increase in volume of waste. The record of decision signed that 162,000 cubic yards of waste material would be removed from the site, and now it's looking that just over 210,000 cubic yards of waste material would be removed from the northern impoundment alone. That's a lot of waste, and it's critical that every step of this process has integrity in it to see that this waste is handled and disposed of as safely as possible. One thing that we learned from the agency in the CAC meeting is that they're currently looking at 4 different types of cofferdams. Now, with having to excavate down to 25 feet, that means that the cofferdams are going to have to be drilled into the ground that much deeper. And so there's a lot of concerns and considerations when we're talking about potentially driving down sheet piling into the bed of the river 70 or more feet. So this is really extensive. We never thought this was going to be easy, but we know, and we've always understood, that it's not impossible. So, we have considerations like the interstate. How is driving this sheet piling so deep going to impact the interstate? What's the noise nuisance going to be for the surrounding community? How will that impact the stability of the slopes of the waste pits? And so there's a lot of things to consider here when we're looking simply at isolating the site itself. One of the items that Gary made clear in his presentation is that the waste is not going to be offloaded via barge. So the waste is going to leave the site on trucks. Now we're talking over 10,000 truckloads of waste material, which I know, that is going to be a lot of traffic for vehicles, but luckily, the access road is not necessarily driving through a neighborhood. It's not a heavily trafficked area. And so, it is going to be a lot, but it's not like, if it were having to drive down Main Street in Highlands or down, main parts of Channelview or Lynchburg where kids are playing, there's parks, it's a fairly easy access to the highway from the waste pits themselves. And it appears that this waste is going to be going just over 100 miles east, and it's going to land somewhere around the Texas-Louisiana border, and we're not exactly sure, but I assure you, we're following along, and we are paying very close attention to where this waste ends up and the regulations that not only control how it gets to its final destination, but then how it's handled and stored and monitored for all of the years to come that this waste will remain toxic. All right, let's talk toxicity for the northern impoundment. So when the record of decision was signed, it was signed to clean up the northern pit down to a level that is understood to be safe for a fisherman scenario. And that's absolutely what we need, because at the end of the day, the San Jacinto River is not only a spawning ground for so many species that live in the Bay and in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's also a place of high recreational use. And so making sure that this site is remediated down to a level that is going to be safe for future generations to recreate and fish in the river is essential. And so when this site was first discovered, we understood that it had multiple types of dioxin in the waste pits, and that one of them in particular, which just so happens to be the most toxic type of dioxin, which is said to be one of the most toxic chemicals ever known to man, is TCDD. And in those early years, the understanding was that it was in concentrations just over 30,000 parts per trillion. Through time, through different storms, through different incidences at the site, we have continued to see an increase in concentration at the site in TCDD. And same thing goes here for the treatability, the waste characterization, and the sampling that was done in the pre-design investigation. And so what we've seen in the data is that the northern impoundments has shown to have TCDD and levels above 96,000 parts per trillion. This is incredibly high concentrations of TCDD. Now, for furans, the latest rounds of testing have shown over 200,000 parts per trillion of furans. And so we know that this site is highly toxic. All right, folks, let's talk about the sand separation area. So when the record of decision was signed, we knew very little about this area. We knew that the sand separation area was just northwest of the northern impoundment, and that it was created from runoff from a dredging operation that was mining sand and mined into the northern pit. And it created this smaller area of lower concentrations of contamination. And the record of decision was signed for monitoring and natural recovery, which essentially means monitoring it, but kind of letting nature take its course, and putting institutional controls in place to ensure that that land far into the future is not allowed to be dredged, that nothing is allowed to be placed in it, like any kind of bulkhead or anything of that nature that would disrupt that contaminated sediment. But in the pre-design investigation, they separated the area into 9 different sections and sampled each of those sections down to 6 feet. And they found that in some of those sections, concentrations of dioxin are much greater than we understood when the record of decision was signed. When the record of decision was signed, my understanding is that we thought that area had, in the 300s parts per trillion dioxin. And from what we're seeing from the latest rounds of sampling and investigating, we're seeing over 3,000 parts per trillion TCDD and over 17,000 parts per trillion furans. Of course, the greatest concern is TCDD. That is, the contaminant of concern here with the greatest toxicity. But it was also observed that one of the areas that has this level of concentration in the sediment is eroding. Much of the area around the sand separation area and on the edges of this area is understood to be a depositional environment. It is gaining sediment. It is actually becoming thicker as layers of sediment are deposited out of the river waters over time. And this hot spot is actually one that was noted in the investigation to actually be eroding. And so the responsible parties contractors, GHD, and their reports, they're the ones that produced these 30% design documents. They say that, remaining consistent with the ROD, MNR, or monitoring and natural recovery, is still applicable, and that institutional controls should only be in place for this one little hotspot area. I'm simply not okay with that. I'm not okay with knowingly leaving a hotspot of dioxin in the river. So I'm not okay with where the sand separation area stands right now. I'm incredibly concerned that right now, at this moment, we know that out in the San Jacinto River, 0 to 1 feet below ground surface, there are furans. And as you continue to get deeper, and especially into that 4 to 6 feet range, you have high levels of dioxin. I'm greatly concerned about this, and please feel free to send me your thoughts and your concerns on this. And we are your advocate on behalf of your community and your environment. And I want to make sure that we're able to move forward with a sound position to advocate for what really is best for this area. In my heart of hearts, I don't think it's monitoring and natural recovery. I don't think it's letting nature take its course and in 5 years, let's review. I simply don't think that that's the best way to go. As of right now, I don't have, my feet firmly on the ground of what is the best way to go, what is the best option, what is the best point to advocate from. So, we're working with various geologists, various experts, and trying to gain an understanding of what is a sound place to advocate from, what is reasonable to take place at this area, now that we understand it is much more toxic than we once understood when the record of decision was signed. All right, so now let's move to the southern impoundments. So right now, just in our preliminary understanding of what the 30% design documents outline for this area, we're concerned there is an area that is a hotspot that is just beyond the site's perimeter. That is where the southwest portion of this area meets the river's water. And the agency, according to the 30% design documents, is not exactly looking at remediating this part of the land. And their reasoning for that is because it is outside of the site's perimeter. Yet I've been told from the Environmental Protection Agency themselves that site perimeters are often ambiguous lines. They are boundaries that are drawn because you have to draw lines to focus the extent of your research within. and you're investigating. And so I'm concerned, though, that we know there is a hotspot just beyond this site boundary that is a hotspot for dioxin. And so we're going to continue looking into this and see what the best course of action is from our understanding and the technical experts that we work with and their understanding of what is feasible and what should actually take place at this land, rather than just simply saying it's beyond the site's boundary and we're not going to do anything about it. Lastly, for the San Jacinto River Waste Pit Superfund site, I want to touch on the waste characterization. So 14 samples were taken from the northern impoundments to go through the process to characterize this waste. And this is so important because the characterization of the waste not only details how it is going to be handled on site and how it will be transported, but how it will ultimately be disposed of or stored in perpetuity. And the sampling that has taken place to do this is not characteristic of the actual waste that's going to be excavated from these areas and ultimately transported for disposal. And the lab reports that detail the sampling in and of itself is over 21,000 pages. And in sifting through these pages, I noticed that there's notes within the lab's reports that say, that the client had asked for certain parts of the data to be removed from the report. So I'm extremely concerned about that. We need completeness, we need transparency, and we need trust. We need to not only ensure that the waste is safely removed from these areas, handled appropriately, put on the roads with the appropriate safety measures in place, but also ultimately disposed of in a way that's going to be looked after for the entire future of that waste's toxic life frame. And over 10 of the locations that were sampled for this characterization were areas that were known to have levels of dioxin below the cleanup standard, below 30 parts per trillion. So sampling from areas that are below the cleanup goal to characterize the waste is not a way to truly represent the waste and to truly classify the waste. And so we're calling on the agency to see that this is redone. The samples for characterization need to truly represent the material that is going to be excavated, hauled off, and disposed of. And it needs to be handled appropriately. And we have to make sure that, we're not only looking out to protect the communities around the San Jacinto River, the health of the river, the ecosystem in Galveston Bay, but also the communities where this waste ultimately goes to. We cannot stand for a position that would potentially allow for this waste to become someone else's problem. It's simply unacceptable, and we are following this closely, and we'll be submitting formal comments to the agency about our concerns with what we've seen in the 30% design for the characterization, as well as the lab reports for the characterization of this waste. All right, let's switch gears and switch project areas, and let's now move into the area of Fifth Ward and talk about a couple of updates and where efforts stand right now with the cancer cluster and known contamination within Houston's greater Fifth Ward. The city of Houston has stepped up and are putting dollars forward and efforts forward to sample for vapors from the known creosote plume. And this is on hold because of COVID. And so, there is a lab that the city prefers to work with, and those who are deeply involved with this area of concern and advocating for the remediation of this known plume of contamination, they stand firmly that this lab is in fact the best entity to work with, and that's based on their methodology and their protocols for sampling and analysis of this material. And so as of right now, this lab, is not comfortable coming to Houston to conduct the sampling because they're coming in from out of state. And as Houston continues to be one of the hotspots in our nation for COVID-19, the lab is simply not comfortable with sending personnel to Houston right now. So that's where we stand. It is still on hold, and we'll continue to provide you updates with that as we learn more. In our last town hall, I let you know that there are certain points that we are advocating to Department of State Health Services to attempt and gain as clear of an understanding of the community's health as possible. And since then, I've had a conversation with Houston Health Department, and they've let me know that they're going to echo our concerns to the state and our request to the state to take a look into childhood cancer. To date, the 3 cancer investigations that Department of State Health Services has conducted have not looked at childhood cancer. And this is essential to truly being able to understand potential exposures and the health of the community today, and as best as we can look into the past. So I was really excited that Houston Health Department is willing to echo that ask to the state. And with what's going on in Greater Fifth Ward, I continue to be impressed by the collaborative efforts from other nonprofit organizations, community leaders, community groups, the super neighborhood, and our government agencies. This is really a stellar example of how working together can create change and progress. And in these types of efforts, when you're dealing with environmental movements, they're often long-term, and you have to celebrate every victory, no matter how big or small, because these efforts can take years, they can be exhausting, and they're often daunting. And so one thing that I wanted to note that I've learned since our last town hall that I believe truly is a great thing for the efforts of understanding what's gone on in the Greater Fifth Ward and what needs to be done, is that, Texas Department of State Health Services is setting up a panel of experts to discuss the feasibility of a full epidemiological study for the community moving forward. And on this panel of experts, Department of State Health Services agreed from a collective ask from various folks. The state has agreed to have a community member representing their community from each of the 4 main communities within Houston's Greater Fifth Ward. So there will be 4 local community members on this panel of experts. And from my experience with working with Department of State Health Services and my experience working on a panel of experts with the state and assessing the feasibility of an epi study, this is a big step. This is a victory for the community. Now, the war has not been won, but there are little battles along the way within the war, and this is absolutely a huge step and a very positive thing. And so for the folks from Fifth Ward, I want you to know that I see this as a huge positive, and congratulations. The government agencies, community groups, community members have raised their voices, have let it be known that they want folks from their community in on this panel representing their truth, their stories, their past. And the state's listened. And so 4 local community members are going to be on this panel. And I couldn't be more excited for you guys. Unfortunately, more times than not, communities don't end up with the results from epidemiological studies or even, a variety of studies. But this is a great step in the right direction. And so I just want to remind you guys to hang in there. And this is a great step in the right direction. We continue to host our health survey on our website, and I encourage all of you to please go to our website, go to the link below, and fill out our health survey so that we can be the best advocates for the health of each of your communities. All right, let's shift gears one more time and head over to our project at the Jones Road Groundwater Plume Superfund site. This is located in Cypress, Texas, and we are still waiting on the rest of the documents from the EPA from our Freedom of Information Act request. You know, we are looking for complete data sets. We are looking for more than just the sampling results for PERC. We're looking at more than just, this latest round of groundwater testing. And so we're still waiting on the rest of those documents. And we right now are hosting a letter on our website. You can follow the link below. We are asking all of you to please go to this link and sign the letter asking the EPA to conduct air monitoring in every unit of the shopping center at the that sits above the Jones Road Groundwater Plume Superfund site. We know that in the 3 shopping units that have been tested, unsafe levels of contaminants have been found in the air. And those 3 units, the agency did respond. It took them a year, but they responded, and they did put in 2 years ago. They put in vapor extraction units in those first 3 units, but we don't have a picture of what the quality looks like in the air of the remaining units within this shopping center. So please help us help you. Visit the link below and fill out this letter that we will mail to the agency, making the request to not only test the air inside of these units, but also the vapors in the subslab, because the vapors in the subslab are direct indicators of the potential for the vapors that are there to migrate through the cement slab and then into the air in the indoor space. Folks that live in the area of the Jones Road Superfund site in the Cypress area, y'all are doing a great job at submitting health surveys to us on our website, and we appreciate you trusting us with your sensitive information. And I am starting to gain a better picture and a better understanding of the community's health. And so if you have not filled out a health survey on our website, you can follow the link below, and please submit your information so that we can ultimately do our best to try to get a picture of the health and see if there might be any potential impacts from known contaminants in the environment. So in closing, I want to thank you for your time, for joining me in this virtual space. I know it's not easy. I know that, we're all trying to navigate this and figure this out, and that we are likely all tuning in different types of devices, and that this is a little out of our comfort zones. But thank you for tuning in and leaning on us to be your advocate and a source of information and a resource for your community. I look forward to being able to have some Zoom webinars in the near future, and I will do my best, as always, as well as our team at THEA, to bring you the latest and the most accurate information related to public health and contaminants in the environment around the Houston region. I will see you here again in a virtual space next month for our updates.